Kevin's going to talk about the work that Kew Gardens are doing, and that will feed into some of our discussions a little bit later.
Thank you very much.
So,
Right, thank you to KaarbonTech for inviting me today to give a bit of discussion about what we've been up to at Kew. So this is still all early research, but we're starting to get some interesting results, and it's starting to guide our succession planning as we look at the Kew landscape. So the Kew's idea and the focus at present is to understand and protect plants, fungi for the well-being of people and the future of all life on Earth. Very big statement. It's not just revolving around us with trees, this is also looking at food security. So a lot of the science teams are looking at how we can get food security for everyone throughout the world. So it's a very big statement, but what we look at within living collections feeds into this. So our aspirations is to end the extinction crisis and how we manage the natural world, and this is how we're going to manage this sustainably and how we move forward. Now again, a lot of this is to do with tropical plants, but also the core value of what Kew does. So we do lots of conservation, that's why we have glass houses, that's why we have living collections. And what we're starting to understand is how these living collections are going to become more important to influence you guys, and hopefully eventually lead into some information into nurseries and how we can push things forward when we start to look at species selection. So we have over 2,000 species of trees and plants within the Arboretum at Kew. So what we started doing is using climatic models to start understanding how those plants are interacting with the landscape. And this is going to become more important. We only have to look at the summer and what we went through this year and the effects that it can have. So what we're starting to understand is through using climatic models is to understand what species have a better success rate, ones that we potentially can see and thrive going forward. We only have to look at this summer and the stress that trees went under. We're trying to understand that and how we can better select trees in order to try and safeguard collections, but also urban landscapes. We all heard from Kenton today about how important trees are within the urban landscape. This is helping us to try to achieve that by trying to increase species establishment. So part of the work I've been doing, and part of my colleague here today is Tom, who's head of plant records. We've been working together on this analysis of our living collections. Okay, this is very biased towards trees, and that's because that's what I look after. So that's where we've been focusing our efforts currently. So if we look, we can see that 15% of the Kew's tree collection as it stands today is within their natural range under predicted climates. Okay, so we're using climate models going out to 2050 and 2090. So these are standardised climatic models and predictions that come from Europe. So we're starting to understand how this is going to affect our trees. So the real interesting section for me currently is, okay, we know the 15%, we know they're going to survive, we know they've got a good chance to still be represented within living collections up to 2090. The real interesting for me is the 38%. So they're right on the edge of their tolerance, and we need to understand how those plants are going to interact with the climate. Okay, so under predicted climatic modelling, these trees are on the very edge of their range. So we need to understand how we can move that 15% and increase that 15%, but also how we can shrink the 38%. And this is the research we've been looking into. So unfortunately, with the 47%, this is where the headache comes. It's looking very unlikely that these trees are going to be represented within the collection at Kew, especially outside where we can't control climatic conditions. So this is where we need to start focusing from a collections point of view. So I know you guys are all managing assets in the urban landscape. Well, we're managing assets for conservation. So this 47% is where we look at how we can distribute this material. So maybe we take propagation material and we share that with other botanical institutes that have got better suitable climate. So this is something when it's an ongoing process, and it's something that's, it's going to take a number of years. There's no quick answer to this, but it's going to take time and study to understand how we can move forward. So just as a bit of interest, and also working with Dr. Andrew Hirons and using a bit of TDAG documents, I started doing an assessment using the same criteria as we do for Kew, and just looked at what's available in the nurseries now. So currently, when we look at current nursery stocks under climatic modelling, 42% are within their natural range. That's great, we've got a good base to work off. We then have 17%, again, which are on the edge of their range. So again, they're the interesting plants for me, where we can where we can find new genetic material with those trees that are probably better suited to our changing climate. We then have the 27%, which unfortunately looks unlikely that they're going to be growing come 2050, 2090, because the climatic change will be too harsh for them to adapt. And then we have the 14%. Now these are the really interesting ones. We're starting to get new data sets, so we can start to fill in the gaps. So the 14% is often cultivars and they're hybrids. We don't have their data because a lot of them don't naturally appear in the wild, or we haven't got that data set. So that's where we're trying to fill in the gaps to have a better understanding. So we all only have to look at this year and look at what the summer did, and we can see these are the predicted increases in temperature. I think for me, as a tree person, as a tree manager, this summer was probably the first realisation I had what truly can be, what looks like it's going to become a theme. And it's quite scary to see the Kew collection suffer so quickly, and it really intrigued me on understanding how we can change management practices, but also species selection, so it doesn't damage the landscape as fast as it has. It's not very nice when you start seeing brown and dead trees. It's not very good for the visitor experience, but it's not very good for us from a collection space, because we could be losing very vulnerable species. So all this information now is leading into us to start helping us with our species selection. So currently our participation levels, this is what we're starting to find is going to be more key for us, especially at Kew, on our soil types. So under predictive modelling, we're going to be looking at between 600 and 650 mil precipitation. Now, for those who come to Kew and know Kew, it's actually planted on a floodplain. It's not the best in the world. This data set here is just on Tilia. So we've actually done the whole living collections, but this is part of my research where I'm looking into Tilia. And we can already start to identify species that are going to be more suitable, just under this modelling. So as we see, a lot of the Japanese and Chinese plants are going to need vast amount of more water than what we can currently provide them naturally at Kew. So those trees would need more intensive management, so irrigation. And we're very fortunate at Kew, because we're a botanical institute, we're allowed to irrigate in hosepipe bands. But those sort of things are going to become more and more difficult. It's becoming very costly, it's becoming very expensive. And if we start to have common droughts like we are now, water's going to become a commodity. So we need to start to adapt our landscape in order to manage this. So this is one of the distribution models that we've been working on. So we now look at where and what plants grow where. And this is all through data analysis. So all the little brown dots are occurrences of Tilia species, but every species, not just one. Ideally, we would start pinning it down to one single taxa to understand the provenance and how important that's going to be moving forward. So we're starting to understand that with trees' natural traits, but also their environment. And the darker the green, the more suited it's going to be to Kew's climatic conditions as we move forward. So when we look at Kew and we look at especially London and southwest London, when we start matching the climatic patterns that we're now seeing, it's more akin to a Mediterranean and sub-Mediterranean climatic conditions. So they're the sort of ecosystems we need to start looking in order to start selecting plants. A lot of our species that we often see as native species in England are actually distributed throughout Europe. You only have to think of oak, for instance. We all call it English oak. It's actually common oak of Europe. So with this sort of information, we can then start to identify appropriate provenance for seed collection and hopefully genetically bring more resistance into how they deal with climatic stress. So again, these are other sections of the globe that we can go and look at. So we've obviously got California, Central Chile, and so on and so forth. These are all interesting sections, and we need to start to understand the flora in those regions to understand how they could fit into the Kew landscape as we move forward to the future. So using lots of different data sets and being able to play around with different systems, we can then start to map precipitation. So what we're starting to try to look at is how we can be building some resilience to the reduced water availability at Kew. So this is one way of doing it, is to map it globally on ArcGIS. So this is a precipitation model. So we then map where the precipitation levels could potentially match us at Kew. Now this is where it's becoming more and more interesting, is learning how trees can hydraulically adapt to drought stress, and they're one of the things we're looking into. So these are the areas under precipitation models which would be suitable for Kew's changing climate. So this is a good example of when we start to look at tree provenance. So the tree on the right hand side, that's Tilia tomentosa. Now unfortunately, really frustratingly for me, I don't know the provenance of that tree because it's been brought in from a nursery stock. Okay, so these are the things that are going to become more important to us as we understand how climate affects trees. And on the left-hand side is Tilia diastyla. Now I know the collection data for that tree. I know exactly where it comes from. It's collected in 1977 in Iran by Roy Lancaster. So we've got all the data, and I've got all the data points for that tree. Now these trees, both photos taken at the same time in the middle of the drought this year. And I don't even need to explain, but you can see which one's growing the best. So this is what's kicked in, and that's how we've been testing these models currently, is by going out and observing and understanding what we see in the landscape, and not just what the modelling is telling us. So in order to understand this, we've got to look at things in more detail. We can't just rely on modelling data. I think we'd be stupid not to. So we need to test it, okay? So the plan is, over the next 2 to 3 years, is to start selecting trees. So currently, under my research, I've selected 3 trees that are going to be within their range, 3 on the edge and 3 on the outside. And then we're growing them currently in batches of 50 in our nursery in order to grow on a plant to allow us to test the modelling to make sure how it's going to react as we move forward. So this is supported by Dr. Andrew Hirons. In all fairness, I hold my hands up, we haven't got the experiment down to a T of how we're going to test it, but I think it's going to be vitally important that we test this modelling data, because then it will give us a good idea of how accurate they can be, and that's why resources like Kew is going to be so important as we move forward. It's one of the biggest, vast resources we have, and that's the same for all tree collections. And the data that we can collect from that will hopefully guide us in hopefully creating a sustainable and future landscape for all of us, not just in botanical gardens, but in the urban landscape. So what we're trying to do, once we've finished with the research, we hope to create a toolkit essentially. So it'll be a selection of advice and tools which you can aid you in species selection. You know, we only have to look at Kew. It has a lot of curation bias. It's often planted with people's favourites, and they're not always suited to the Kew's conditions. So what we're trying to do is come away from only planting our favourite trees, but using a bit more science and data to help us select trees that are going to be more suitable to our climate. So we're climatic matching rather than just choosing our favourites. So with the emphasis on that, we hope that the success of this programme, we can then start to understand the Kew landscape and what that Kew landscape will look like by 2090. But it's not only work that I'm doing, there's a lot of work that Tom does to help us with that, and we need to understand how we can manage the landscape and how it could even go down to irrigation management. So that's another thing we're looking at. So if we know we have plants that require a certain amount of irrigation, let's say we look at East Asia, a lot of the plants in East Asia will need over 1,000 mil of precipitation. We could then look at adapting irrigation management. So frustratingly for us, Q is taxonomically led out. So all the trees are grouped together. As we move through and we understand what's happening to our environment, we now know that's not going to be always possible to do. So with some of these information coming out of this research, we can then start to look at how we redesign and plant our landscape. So for instance, for us, if we start to look at plants, especially things that require a vast amount of water, we can then start grouping them so we can target and manage irrigation in areas rather than trying to irrigate the whole site. So again, this is just what I was just coming on to. So understanding what precipitation we're getting on site is going to help us to try to understand our landscape and the soils. So Q is really interesting. We're on gravel and sand. It's a pretty rubbish place to plant an arboretum, in all fairness. We'd like a bit more clay and a bit more soil types, but generally we're on a high leaching point soil. So we lose vast amount of water and nutrients through the soil column, and therefore we've always struggled. So if anyone's ever come to Q, you see we do a lot of soil management, do lots of air spading, adding of organic mulch. This is all resources that we need, but we still rely on water, and that's what we've got to understand. So hopefully with all this new information and understanding of how trees are going to start interacting with our landscape and climates, we're hoping to move forward to a more sustainable landscape. But this is why the opportunity with KaarbonTech to have some of your data to understand what's happening in the urban environment. This is fine for me at Q. I've got 4 walls, I can pretty much do what I want inside those 4 walls, and I can manage my data. But that's fine, but it's the communication out. What's the point of me doing all these studies and understanding if it doesn't help local authorities, it doesn't help the urban canopy cover? And that's something as professionals, we all have a responsibility to help maintain as we move forward. So that's why the opportunity to work with KaarbonTech and Mark come up with the idea, it was a good idea so we can start better understand what happens outside of Q. So if you're interested in any more research of what we're doing, obviously it's the same as everyone else, there's your QR code.
Super. Thank you very much.